I'm just going to put my timer on just a minute.
Today, I'm joined by an extraordinary change and culture facilitator who helps individuals, teams, organisations, and communities gain clarity about what's important to them and where they should be focusing their energy specifically. He specialises specifically in helping leaders create values-based cultures with 3 decades of experience at a leadership level across 3 countries, Australia, England, and India. I'd like to welcome on the show Stephen Barclay. Stephen, it's such a pleasure to have you here on Reset Your Thinking podcast.
Thank you. It's absolutely gorgeous to be with you, and thank you so much for that warm welcome.
You're so very welcome. I appreciate you. So, Stephen, firstly, tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, great. I'm coming from Yagara country, which is Brisbane in Queensland. I spent the first part of my 24 years of my life in Queensland, and then I moved to Newcastle, where I was for 16 years. And then I moved to India, where I was for 13 years. And in the middle of Newcastle and India, I was also in the UK for a year. So I'm a little bit of I love to travel and love to get around. And my
Yes.
background and career has been largely in the healthcare industry, but across a number of other industries as well.
Fantastic. Terrific. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, it does sound like you do love a bit of a travel. That's awesome. So, just in regards to your leadership journey, then, given that you're as we mentioned in the introduction, you've got quite 3 decades of experience at a leadership level. Can you elaborate a little bit about your leadership journey?
Yeah, thanks. From day one of my first full-time job at the age of 20, I was in charge of a department of 6 people. And it was big. I got the job because I had a particular relevant degree. There was somebody in the department who had been doing the job, and because she didn't have the degree, she didn't get the job. So I had
Right.
that as a 20-year-old to deal with. And it was tough. And, I was ringing my dad, I was ringing people who were older than me, I was speaking to my boss, trying to work out how I would manage this. And look, as a 20-year-old, when you look back on that, your emotional maturity is, pretty, depends on how you're growing up, but I felt my emotional maturity wasn't that strong. So, but those types of situations only help you to grow. And in the next 4 years, I just kept going up into higher positions with more staff. I went then into a department in charge of 19 staff, and then I went to a department in charge of 40 staff. So I really had to learn quickly what works and what does not. There was pain. And so I was constantly looking for mentors to give me guidance on, particularly on the people side of the business. I mean, the technical side is always something you can work hard at and get at, but people management, that's a big thing. And then I would say the majority of the times in those first 4 years, I was the youngest one in the department.
Wow.
So
That's incredible, and I just want to congratulate you too. What an amazing opportunity for a 20-year-old. That's unheard of, right? I mean, it's very sort of few and far between have such an opportunity to be able to lead a team. And then, as you said, suddenly you're this 20-year-old and you're right in what you mentioned too there, Stephen, in that at that age, we're still developing our emotional intelligence and we're not there yet. And there's so much learning to have. And suddenly you've been confronted.
I'm laughing. I'm thinking, am I there yet? And I'm 54. I mean, it definitely, every aspect of your life, if you have a bit of a reflective bent, enables you to keep thinking about your emotional maturity.
Certainly, absolutely. And so you started off with a group just a small group, and then you won a position and you had 19 staff, and from there
To 40.
40.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And it was interesting, and then from there I moved into a quality position, and
Right.
for a large teaching hospital, so it was all aspects of process improvement and change. And then I was working with all levels of the organization, from the wardman to the receptionist, to the surgeon, to the CEO. And, I learned that was really where I learned communication. I mean, I'd learned it in those other jobs, but, getting things done, uh, time management, project management. But most importantly, I think the thing that has really stayed with me is the skills that I learned around facilitation, systems thinking, and quality improvement. That really helped me get a bigger picture of
Absolutely. But
things.
sorry to interrupt you there, but there's also the pressure. That particular environment is very high pressure environment, not to mention very fast paced, and you've got to think on your feet. You've got things happening all the while around you. People's lives are at stake. You've got so many different responsibilities as a leader, and then to be able to think quick, problem solve, and do all of that, that takes a lot of skill, a lot of resilience too, and a lot of responsibility on you as a leader. Would you agree?
Yes, definitely. And I think, in terms of resilience, it's on the job training, I think, and having a strong family circle, friend circle in which you are with you on the journey to continually to reflect about what's going on. And so I think that's been an important part, but also how to build strong relationships at work, and knowing boundaries as well. Um, and boundaries in terms of when you first come into a career, the boundaries thing is the most difficult. Because you're just used to as a teenager, and you're having lots of friends, and then all of a sudden you're a boss, and then all of a sudden all of these dynamics come. So I think that's definitely my understanding of how to manage boundaries, but also how to be empathetic and compassionate at the same time, and have a level of connect that people feel committed to working with you.
Absolutely. You make some incredible points right there. Boundaries is not something that we're taught. And a lot of people, many people do feel uncomfortable with the thought of even setting boundaries, which brings me to my next point. Today, we're going to be chatting about predominantly values. And I guess also with all that's going on at the moment too, most people, and I must confess, I was one of them, I really had no idea of what values were, what they even meant, how they even, I guess, mattered in the workplace. And it does have a lot to do with setting boundaries and all of that, and what they even stand for. And they do have profound power basically around the decisions that we make, how we think, what we do. So I'm curious, Stephen, what's your interpretation of values?
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting question, and when I'm working with values, initially, um, I don't use the word, and
Right.
and so it's around about conversations with people with what matters to them.
Nice.
Because we're in organizations, we're used to the word, but when it comes to personal, and actually knowing what my value system is, and knowing how to have conversations about that, we're not so used to it.
Not.
There's definitely the rise of values-based education, but it's still spasmodic around the world, and how to incorporate, give children a values vocabulary. And I think that's once you start to have conversations about what is it that really matters to you, and that's when people start to use the word values themselves. It's the key thing is what matters to me.
Yeah.
What matters to me as a person, and then people say, my family, and then they'll say, well, I really value my family, and then they'll use the word value, and then you can begin to lead off on that. So I don't get too caught up on the definition, because what's the difference between a value and a virtue, and all of those aspects. But I think it's a gradual. It's just started off with a conversation. What matters most to you? What
Thank you. Sorry, go right ahead.
Yeah, what matters most to you and personally, and then from an organizational context, what matters most to us.
I love that. And thank you so much for sharing all that. That makes so much sense, because how often do we go into the values conversation, and values, the word itself, I think gets thrown around so flippantly, and there is no meaning placed on it per se. Yet when you come from a space of what you've just shared with us, from what is really important to you, it just makes it, even just saying that, I think gives a different emotion. It starts from here. It's almost passion, isn't it? When you say, well, what really matters to you? And I love that you've also included workplace there too, because, Stephen, brings me to our next question now. We can all sort of agree that it's been quite the year, with even the most experienced leaders having their confidence rattled with the ongoing challenges and disruptions of COVID-19. And there is a lot of talk out there at the moment about where to from here, and, and what are people looking at in terms of future and building the capability of what lies ahead. And do you believe that values, or what's important to people, and becoming familiar with values, matters during this time? And if so, how and why?
I think there's a couple of ways to answer that. And I think the first one is it has mattered.
Yeah.
What I've noticed personally is the increase in the posts on social media or blogs around values compared to last year.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely a conversation going on at many different levels. So I think it has mattered, and there's definitely organisations that have stood up. There was definitely the high-profile case with respect to Facebook and not doing enough, and so organisations withdrew their advertising money from Facebook,
Yes.
and saying you are not doing enough, and our values are ... and it's
Right.
not keeping, and that was really happening.
Mm.
And that there were organizations who used their values to pivot,
Right.
in terms of, this is where we're at, we've lost this market, we've lost that, and they sit down and they talk to their staff, and they say, this is what's really important, what can we do? And they use that, the fact that they've already established a strong conversation or a habit around talking around their values and using their values in dilemmas, that they were ready, they were values ready.
Yeah.
So people, there are lots of examples of organizations that are using it. There's an organization called B Corp, which is, organizations that are really focused around purpose-driven, and you get accredited to be part of this B Corp. Now, B Corp have been really out there and promoting values-driven organizations, and they're worldwide, and people showing and giving examples of how they've used their values. So
Right.
it's definitely, the profile of values has increased dramatically. But
Yeah.
but as you said earlier, it is bandied around a little bit. On Twitter, I have created a list of people who have some values work in what they do, and I have to keep modifying, because I'll look at it and I'll have values in their profile, and then when I start to look at it, I said, yeah, not really.
Yeah.
Their definition of the values, and what's really important to me is not the values. I'm really interested in those people that are promoting conversations around values, not promoting specific values. Because when it comes to an organization, it's diversity, and we
Yeah.
want diversity, and we need that big group of people that are coming from different cultures and different ways of doing things. But the most important thing is that we have a conversation around our values,
Yeah.
and that's when they become really enacted. So it's not so important, to my mind, what the values are. But having said that, from the work that I've done with organisations across the world, there will be common ones that will always be there, or in some shape or form. And the one that is really big this year is integrity.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Gosh, you made so many great points there. And talking is so key, right? Bringing everybody together. And as you mentioned, it's not necessarily about the values per se. It's listening to what's important. It's coming together and focusing on what's our purpose, what's our main, what's our big why right now as a team, as a community. Where is it that we want to go? Where are we headed? What's our direction? And knowing that in itself raises and brings to surface our values inadvertently, really, without even thinking about it, because we're sort of having those conversations and we know what's important to us. So I think you made some very relevant points right there. Thank you. I really do appreciate you sharing that.
I'm not sure if I've answered all aspects of your question, but yeah.
You have, and which brings us then to the next question, because you did sort of very briefly elaborate a little bit on communication. So what's your view on the communication problem? Because, you mentioned talking is really important, and I couldn't agree with you more. As a communication strategist and expert, communication is everything. And without it, we simply cannot communicate, nor can we influence. And what is your view on the communication problem, the effect upon, I guess, organizations, the results that they're, or non-results that they're having, team cohesion, and other aspects of the organization? How, if at all, do values have anything to do with these issues, challenges, problems, disconnections?
Yeah, everything. I think values is the most underutilized resource that an organization has in terms of an asset. Um, it's organizations put a lot of effort to make sure that all of their assets are being fully utilized. Otherwise, they're a liability, or they dispose of those assets. But we just don't know how to work with values and use them on a day-to-day basis. And they are powerful. I'll just tell you a short story of it was a university that I was working with, and they had a cohort of a batch of 40 students, and they were public health students, and they were at the end of their first year, and the senior lecturers were finding that there wasn't a great deal of cohesion amongst them. And they need the cohesion because they need to do group work, they need to go on field visits, and the more cohesion is, the better their results are. So there is an impact when there's not cohesion, and they weren't quite sure what to do about it. And so we ran some values-based activities, and when we got this group of students together, I didn't know who were the ones that were having the problems. And as you could imagine, in the very first exercise, the two people that had the most problem, I paired them together.
Right.
No idea. And so it was some questions which was around, I think, what was a favorite book, or what was your favorite music, who was somebody that influenced you in your life and why that was. They had 3 questions. They had to listen to each other's answers. And at the end of the day, when one of these 2 women was sharing, she was saying that I had this vision, I had this image, I had this created this profile of what this woman was in my mind. And after that conversation, I realized what I had created was completely wrong. And you could feel the energy shifting in the room in the first 20 minutes. And so the key around working with values, the first step is shared meaning.
Yes.
And so you bring people together and establish shared meaning. And so when it comes to an organization and you've got your espoused values, is enabling people to have a conversation on what's important, because they need to be able to see where their personal values fit into the picture.
Yeah.
As much, and how does that align? How does my value fit in with the organizational value, and have a conversation about that. And so even afterwards, I got feedback from the faculty, the professors, and they said that change was sustained. That after that day, everything shifted, because they got a better understanding, a shared meaning of what was important to them and what they valued, and so that enabled them to hold judgment. Withhold judgment, and be more compassionate about where that person was was coming from. And it never ceases to amaze me that how these simple questions, people will say, I can't believe we've never done this as a group. And it's, you know, it's a real investment to just have an hour for your team to have simple conversations like that, but they're purposeful because you're leading them towards having a conversation around our organizational values. So yes, they're an important part of communication. Communication strategies will be so much more effective if they include alignment with personal and community and organizational values.
Yeah, absolutely.
My opinion.
Yeah, look, thank you for sharing your story, because I think that story has so much power in it. And, you know, how often do we, I'll change the question, like we don't know a lot about values. And so what happens is that we bring our own values to work and they tend to overlap, or sometimes they're just so very different. Any wonder then is there so much conflict and so many misunderstandings within the workplace. And I love what you said there and the amazing work that you did for these people, because particularly in such an environment where learning is key, right? So we all have different meanings when it comes to learning, and again, values are so very different around that. So coming to and creating this beautiful little, I suppose, mutual understanding around what values, how are we going to be driven together is enormous. And I have no doubt that the result would have been profound. So that's great work there. That's fantastic.
Well, it's interesting, something that you just said there is that if you don't have that conversation, there will be values filling the vacuum.
Yeah.
You have no doubt about that.
Yes.
So if you're not going to talk about your espoused values, there will be something to fill that vacuum, and it will be the values. And those values will be working. My colleague and I are working with an organization who is 75 years old, has a big footprint in their industry in the country that they're in. And they didn't have an espoused list of values. So they've gone through this process of listing what their values are. But before that list of values, and you have the conversations, and that's what they did, and that's how the values came out, was just listen to the stories. And then those stories, it told them, but they're also trying to shape values for the future to take them into the next step. So they're also being creative. So, and that's why the medium and the way to get into working with values is through stories, because stories connect to the heart. And that's how you get into that, from the identified espoused values to the socialization of those values, is through stories. And that's a continuous part of what I call the values life cycle. Because there's many aspects in managing, from identification to socialization, to embedding them into systems and processes, to measuring the impact of them, to renewing your values. Organizations often go through that process every 5 or 10 years, and so that value is not really working for us anymore, and this one is more, and moving it on. So it's a constant process. Like any asset that we have, it has a life cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. You know what you just said is so key, Stephen, because I think unless we have these conversations, I mean, we could go on about this for so long now, because you've just opened a can of worms. It's so important. Not having these conversations with our people, not knowing where everybody's at. And these discussions need to be daily, by the way. You know, people need to know how people are traveling daily, because this is where it all comes to the attention of, and it surfaces any issues that may be that we may be experiencing in our organizations or whatever. If we don't know what's important to us, then essentially this culture can create itself if we don't take hold of it, and we don't create, I guess, a unified group of values where we're all sort of directed in a particular way. Otherwise, it's open to anything and anyone, and then all of a sudden it goes into all different directions, and any wonder then stuff isn't happening, or the results aren't the results that we want. So having these discussions continuously is huge, isn't it? Like, it's massive. It's important.
Yeah, but values work is culture work.
Totally.
And it's, if you You know, many years ago, I attended a workshop by a great systems thinker, Peter Senge, who was author of a book called, he was a group of people, The Learning Organization. The fifth discipline, it was called The Learning Organization. I attended a workshop and he said, what people do, what people don't do, what people say, and what people don't say creates culture. And for me also, I added to that was that the stories that they say and the stories that they have in their mind create culture. And so it's important to listen to them because those stories can often have a little bit of a furphy thrown into it or a little bit of somebody's perception, and then it begins to change the whole way things work within an organization. So listening to stories is an important part of it.
Totally. Stories is so important because it just brings out so much of the individual, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which brings me to my next question, actually, and I think I'll just get to the question and see how we go here. So, in your experience, do you believe then that values work in organisations is actually values work, or is it just a form of managerial control masquerading as values work? And I think your storytelling might sort of somehow,
there's been some interesting work, research around the gap between espoused values and enacted values. And definitely we did I can't remember where it was, but we did an online workshop this year. It was around values, and one of the participants said that he had been in 10 for the last 10 years, 2 major MNCs, multinational companies, and the values weren't mentioned once, weren't discussed, weren't talked about, but they were on the walls. And we know from the Enron experience, and you walked into Enron building, the values were clear and on the wall, but they weren't being used. So there will always be a gap between espoused and enacted. And I think that's a realization that I've had just recently. There will always be a gap. But you have to keep having a conversation about it and talking about it and measuring it and bringing the feedback to people and having conversations about it, because the research shows that there is a strong correlation between commitment and engagement and enactment of espoused values. So the organization says, these are our values, and the people of the organization see a high degree of behavioral integrity.
Yes.
Then they will be more committed and more engaged to the organization. But if there's a larger gap of less behavioral integrity in alignment to those espoused values, then they'll be more cynical, there'll be less commitment and less engaged. So, this is an Australian-based article, which has become a seminal research article, and that has really impacted the whole conversation around espoused and enacted values.
Absolutely. And in terms of behavioural integrity, would you mind elaborating a little bit more on that, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, walking the talk, practicing what I preach. That, you know, the value is integrity, but what does that look at a granular level? They say that the values is both micro and macro work. And so there's real granular stuff. So the espoused values is your macro work, and the detailed conversations of what it looks like and feels like on a day-to-day basis is our micro work.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what, at the end of the day, it really does start from the leader. It starts from top down, really. It's like a parent and a child. You know, if we expect our kids to do one thing, well, we've got to be able to walk the talk, and we've got to be able to really display what we want from our kids as well. So the same in a leadership position. If I, as a leader, am not walking the talk and living the values, how is it that I expect my people to do the same? So it really needs to, it must, and I can't stress enough that it needs to start from top down.
So I think that this realization that I had that there will always be a gap between espoused and enacted values
Mm,
helps you be much more gentle and easy. It's a
mm,
process. Because I can remember we did this exercise at a large teaching hospital I was working in New South Wales. Now, this organisation had been going for 10 years. When they established the organisation, there'd been an earthquake in that city and they brought 3 hospitals together
mm,
and into the one place. And they all had their own different cultures. And 10 years later, you'd
mm.
go into the operating theatre and in the tea room, there'd be the staff from this hospital in this corner, this hospital in this corner, and this hospital in this corner. And the ones in the middle were the ones that had come from outside.
Wow.
And so we had this conversation around values. And it was a conversation that the organisation had been going for 12 years and they hadn't had that. So we enabled people the opportunity to talk about what was important to them.
Mm-hmm.
And we used art. We brought in a film director. We went around and did videos of people within the organisation. And then we used those videos of them talking about what this value means to me to stimulate a conversation in focus groups,
Right.
so that the people could begin to see what was important. And then what happened was magic in those, and it happened many times. People said to me, I can't believe I've been working for this person for 10 years and didn't realize that she valued the same things that I do.
Wow, that's powerful, isn't it? And what a wonderful exercise that would have been to be able to create and bring so many things to surface. That's
Yeah,
incredible.
and look, it's not a one-off exercise. This whole thing of a values life cycle
Mm,
um, is important. And what happened after that exercise was that we were going around and we were doing the socialization process and listening to people's stories about the living and enactment of these values. And then the very next day, I had somebody came up to me into the corridor and he said, I told you this values thing wasn't going to work. We were talking about this conversation yesterday, and today I saw this person doing this.
oh, right.
And so that's the part of the process, is that it is a process, and there
Yes.
will be a gaps between espoused and enactment. We just have to be easy on us, and we have to get better at having the tough conversations
Absolutely.
around
Yeah.
values.
Yeah. And it's about being consistent. Consistency is key. And to be doing it and to be repeating it and to be building this and talking about it, I think is
Yeah,
absolute key.
and the part of that process of after you've the socialization is then how do you build
Mm,
the values into your marketing process? How do you build it into your procurement process? How do you build it into the HR processes? So the selection, the performance management. So it's that whole living aspect
mm,
of bringing it into your organization and into your systems and processes. So you're
mm,
creating opportunities for the conversations to be had. You're
mm.
developing your strategy, your values are there, and you question your strategy options against your values.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And what comes to mind as you were saying that, Stephen, is that what perfect time than now, where most businesses are coming back, and a lot of businesses are also recruiting for new people. And
Mm,
what a wonderful time to start this process, because it doesn't happen overnight. As you just mentioned, there are so many different areas, so many different. The process is enormous, and so right now, as we all sort of come back after the time away, after lockdown and everything, I think this is an optimum time now to maybe be considering this quite seriously. How is it that we can do it differently and implement all of this process for us to be more values driven, so that we're all on the same page?
yeah, look, I think uh, values is becoming more of a science.
Mm,
There's definitely a lot of universities that have a values-based leadership institutes and values-based culture center for values-based culture. So the science, there's a lot of research being done, and so it's not rocket science.
mm,
And so there are ways to work with values.
Yeah.
But it's not something, and doesn't need to be difficult, and you
No.
don't need to have a degree or anything like that to work with values. And what I love doing with organisations is working with them and being able to step out, and that they can do it, and occasionally they'll come back and check with us or have a conversation. But the most important thing is that we've left them with the capability to work with their values and turn them into an asset.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head a few times during our conversation today, in that it's really about listening to the stories, that pretty much tells us so much if we're listening to hear. That is so important. That is so
If
important.
you have shared meaning,
Mm,
then you have shared using.
yeah.
If you have shared using, then you have shared living.
Yeah.
And
Beautiful.
it starts with conversations, ends with conversations.
Mm,
You cannot leave the conversation out of the equation.
yeah. Absolutely. Very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. So, Stephen, what do you think are the top or must have values in any organisation to ensure great culture?
Look, I think I answered this a little bit before, in that I'm not so, people aren't interested in being prescribed a value. What they're wanting to know is, they want to know, what is the shared meaning around that value? What do you mean by that? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to us? What's my story around that? What's your story around that? What's our story?
Mm,
And as I said, I've been lucky enough to be working with values for the last 20 years. And I attended a program on living values education, and I was just an observer. And I ended up becoming the coordinator of the living values education program here in Australia for 5 years, in the late 90s and early noughties. And I had the privilege of facilitating programs with about 240 teachers across the country.
mhm,
And I really got to see the power of values. What we were doing is, we were facilitating programs where we were, first of all, the teachers were getting to know their own values, and the whole concept, values are caught, not taught.
mhm,
Um, and then how to incorporate values conversations into their curriculum, how to incorporate it into maths, into geography, into history, so that the children had a vocabulary around values. And so we would come back and we'd have follow-up with these teachers, and these transformation in their classrooms and transformation in their schools. So I really got to see the power of values. And the point was, yeah, we had a few values that we talked about, peace and cooperation, and but the thing is that having these conversations in different countries, I noticed there was common values that kept coming up.
mm.
And those values were around trust and honesty and integrity.
Right.
Um, However, I still wouldn't dictate to an organisation, you must have these
Mm,
values.
mm,
What really matters to you now? What matters about the community and the context in which you're operating?
mm.
And the words will come up to them.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of watching them create it. I wouldn't want to have it any other way.
Mm,
Sometimes you do a little bit of wordsmithing with them and helping them, but it's just the joy of watching them it come, because the values are inside of us. You just have to create the space for people to have the conversation. So,
absolutely.
there has been some really nice work on values mapping in organisations of the espoused values, and putting them into some categories, and they're quite useful to help you see if you've got covered your bases with respect to your values. Are you just too much inward looking with your values and not enough outward looking? And so it's good to have some of those frameworks to help you to evaluate and assess your chosen values against.
Mm,
But personally, I'm not in the habit of saying that you must have this value, you must have that value. Just let's have a conversation and we'll
mm.
work it out.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that, because it's really about having someone like yourself to be able to facilitate those conversations, to be able to then extract the right information. Because sometimes we just don't know how to articulate things, like we just don't know what we don't know. We know what we're feeling and thinking, but we just don't know how to get it out.
Yeah.
And so to be able to have someone like yourself, myself, and yourself in particular, I guess, with the experience that you've had in this environment, in this with values, is important. And I've seen some great work that you've done as well. So that's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that, Stephen. That's terrific.
My pleasure. It's been a great conversation, because I think that the more you talk about it, the more you understand, and it becomes your own teacher, the conversation. So, that's why I jump at the opportunity to talk about values at any time, because I always learn something myself.
Absolutely. And I know that we covered so much today, but just very quickly, when you work with organizations to help them put their values to work, what exactly is it that you do? Or just give us a little bit of a brief, helicopter ride on what you do and how you go about it.
Yeah, thank you.
So welcome.
One is understanding that the what part of the values life cycle that they're at. And so, they may be at the identification stage, which is the organisation we've been working with at the moment. And then there's the socialisation stage, and that is around having conversations. So in this particular organisation, they've selected a cohort of about 14 leaders from across the organisation, various ages, as in years of experience in the organisation, and they will be leading the conversation. So we're coaching them and training them how to facilitate and host conversations, to socialise their selected values, but to draw out stories. So we're teaching them how to tell stories themselves, but then how to host the story, how to hold the space, and then also how to make sense of those stories and what they mean. So we work in that socialization. We also work with the organisation and helping them embed them in all of their systems and processes, and what that would look like. What are the questions that they need to be asking themselves? And then, what measurement systems that they might have to help them determine the return on investment of working with values. What's the impact around commitment, engagement? What's the impact in safety terms, in terms of lost days of work or injuries or those types of things? And then we work with organisations who may be at the other end of the values life cycle, where they've had their values for 10 years and they're revisiting it. And we work with them to host the conversations around those values and the direction that they want to go. Sometimes we will help the organisation do an audit at the very beginning, to help them a cultural audit with respect to those values, to how well they've been socialised. They may have well and truly had their values for some time, but they're just a poster on the wall, and on their coffee mug and on their screensaver, but that it hasn't been embedded in the organisation systems and processes. So all of those aspects of values work, it is very much story-based work. But then you have your other structural aspects that I said about building them into systems and processes: HR, recruitment, procurement, marketing, sales. How you bring it into all of those parts of the organisation. So that's the type and style of work that we do. It's very facilitative, as I mentioned before. Building the capability. So in this organisation we're building their capability to host stories, so that when we step out in 6 months' time, that they just continue it, and every now and then we'll come back and just check out and see how they're going.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I love that you mentioned that you teach how to tell the stories, because we don't all know how to do that either.
Yeah.
We think we do, but we don't. And we may not do it in a way, or we may not have the right strategy to be able to get the result that we want or extract the right information. So to be able to to be able to be shown how to do that, I think that's so powerful in itself, because not only does it help us, create an incredible working environment, it also helps us personally too, I think, because we could take that sort of information home and create that in our own home, in our own personal space.
Well, the interesting thing is that we don't actually teach them. Again, we facilitate it. So we started off,
Great point.
we get them to tell a story.
Yes.
And we tell them that, keep your story to 1 minute, and then I time it, but I don't interrupt them. And then, got 14 people and they'll tell a story, and then we debrief.
Wow.
And then we will ask, what did we do well in that storytelling, and what do you think that we can improve to have a bigger impact on our stories? They came up with all the answers. We did a few sort of content delivery, but again, they came up with what's a good story, how to do a story, which stories worked for them, which stories didn't. Ones that went on for 5 minutes. There was a personal hero journey story. There was a story about somebody else. There was all different types of stories, and again, it was the power of facilitation and showing them. They have the knowledge around stories and good storytelling.
Beautiful.
And you just bring it, you engage the wisdom in the room, and then at the end of it, you throw in a little bit of content.
That is beautiful. And I'm so glad that you corrected me on that, because yes, teaching and facilitating is so very different. It's chalk and cheese, right? And to be able to, and I want to highlight what you did say, and that is, you don't interrupt them. To create a space, a safe space for somebody, and to be present to them, and really to just allow them to say or to express what they want to express, is probably the most important time, because that's where all the gold comes out, right? That's where all the important stuff comes out. And to know how to do that is key, isn't it, Stephen?
Yeah, well, also they got to see, we told them 1 minute, right? And there were some that did 5 minutes. So in their reflections, they were going, the one that did it in 90 seconds were the ones that were the best. The ones that did it in 5 minutes. So we didn't have to correct anybody. They, as a collective, they got off and we did our, the Zoom breakout rooms, and they identified it and they fed it back, and it wasn't, and we said, what could we do collectively, not individually, etc. What could we do collectively? And so, that was the thing around the timing. They then said, yeah, no, 5 minutes doesn't work, or this doesn't work, or scripted doesn't work. It's genuine, heartfelt integrity. Those stories that were heartfelt were the ones that touched me the most. And they, okay. They learn.
Beautiful. Fantastic. Wow, what an amazing way to facilitate such a program. That's terrific. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So just one last question, if I may. If there's one piece of advice that you can impart to managers, leaders, what would that be?
Pause button. have a permanent pause button on your computer. Just a picture of a pause button. Have a pause button at the head of your bed. Have it throughout the house, and learning how to pause. And pause before an important decision is being made. Pause before you press send on that email that you think is potentially a bit poisonous. But connected with pause is reflection. I think the two are interconnected. And the more we create opportunities for pause, and I think a lot of people have really got this during COVID. They've found it hard, but people are making more sourdough bread. People are doing more time with their family. A whole heap of things have changed, and there has been a lot of pausing. Some people have found that difficult, but some people have been appreciated that they've rediscovered the importance of a pause button. And then the second thing is reflection, and building in personal reflection as a daily routine and a daily habit, and starting small, but also building it into your group and team processes, because it's really how we ask our reflective questions are really important for the growth of our teams, the growth of our organisations on a regular basis, getting us to really reflect about what worked, what didn't. And we did this a lot with organisations as they had, 2 to 3 months after working from home, we pressed the pause button and enabled them to reflect on what was their experience. And that was very useful to the management to realise what was working for them, what they were missing about the office, and what things that they needed to address. And that came through pause and reflect.
Wow. Stephen, I just want to say thank you so much. You know what? That's powerful advice. That's extraordinary advice. And I think it's important, particularly as leaders, how we're always in a rush to do this and to do that and to get this finished and to hurry up the conversation. And I think it's really important, as you said, to just pause and be present and then reflect. So thank you so very much. I can't thank you enough today for your time and for your insights and for your expertise that you brought to Reset Your Thinking podcast and, sharing it all with us too.
Yeah, I think that the key is resetting your thinking is the pause button.
Yeah.
And we can do it, and we can build in the drinking of the water becomes a pause, that getting up to go and make the coffee is a pause. There are opportunities. We can do it. It's not difficult. And thank you so much for inviting me. As I said to you, the opportunity to talk and just reflect on what I know has been fantastic. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. You're so very welcome. And I too am honoured to have you here today on our show. So thank you so much, Stephen. It's been wonderful having you. And thank you too to our listeners and our viewers here on Reset Your Thinking. Look, if you'd like to make contact with Stephen, please be sure to visit our website, anchor.fm/Reset Your Thinking, where you can access Stephen's details and subscribe to the show in Breaker, Google, Radio Public, Spotify, Anchor, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. And if you found value in this show, we would greatly appreciate a rating on Anchor. And please feel free to share the link with your friends, colleagues, and networks.